This photo from 1990 shows a father and son looking happy and proud. Known back then as the owners of one of Australia's top stud farms, they raised award-winning Corriedale sheep and their lives seemed picture perfect. But just 2 years later, that perfect picture shattered. 7 gunshots ended both their lives, along with the life of a woman who lived with them, in a shocking murder that would reveal some jaw-dropping secrets about the father in that very photo. Now, while looking into this case, I realized not much has been said about it over the years. The media barely touched it, and information is scarce. But one person changed everything. Bob Perry, the father's secret lover for over a decade. Turns out, there was a whole other side to his life, one full of secrets and drama that no one saw coming. The reason behind the murders wasn't simple, and just like always, we're about to piece together the clues and dive deep into the secrets that led to the tragic deaths of the Wetenhall family. For starters, the main focus of this story is Darcy Wetenhall. When the murders took place, Darcy was already in his 50s, and at that time, his son Guy Wetenhall was about 23. Darcy had made a name for himself as an incredibly talented sheep breeder, and in the world of sheep farming, he was considered a bit of a legend. His reputation was well known, and he was highly respected for his work. However, when we take a closer look at his past, especially his childhood, we begin to see that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. It turns out Darcy didn't have the fairy tale upbringing people might have assumed. His childhood was marked by hardship, and while not much was known about the details, there are enough clues to paint a picture of someone who faced a tough and troubled start. For one, Darcy had a tendency to run away, and not just once or twice. He left home pretty early, trying to escape to the city, but it's unclear exactly what drove him there. Some people believe he was running away from the abuse he faced at home, especially from his mother. Others think he was just after some kind of adventure, something bigger and different from the life he had known. Whatever the real story is, it's obvious that Darcy's younger years were filled with turmoil, confusion, and a lot of running away. What's interesting about Darcy is that he had this complicated personality that made him both hard to understand and hard to forget. On one hand, he could be incredibly generous, offering kindness and help when you least expected it. But on the other hand, he had this darker side. People who knew him would often describe him as being cruel and quick-tempered, especially when things didn't go his way. By the time Darcy hit his teenage years, things had taken a pretty big turn. He ended up living with his cousins Rupert and Janet Wetenhall. Now, Rupert and Janet weren't just any regular relatives. They were the ones who owned the stud farm that Darcy would eventually inherit. And this wasn't just a small farm either. The Wetenhall family's stud farm, Stanbury, located on Devon Road in Ceres, Victoria, was a massive deal in Australia. The farm had been in the family since 1951, when Rupert and Janet had bought it. They had put in the hard work and dedication to make Stanbury one of the most respected and well-known stud farms in the country. The farm became famous for breeding world-class, award-winning Corriedale sheep. They weren't just any sheep. These sheep were the kind that made a name for themselves not just locally but internationally. Sadly, Rupert Wetenhall passed away on July 21, 1962, while he was in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He had been there on an international trip, trying to sell his prized sheep to overseas buyers. It's a tragic turn of events, but also meant that the farm and all of its legacy was passed on to his family, including Darcy. Now, as you might expect, Darcy eventually found himself stepping into his cousin Rupert's shoes, taking up the mantle and continuing the legacy of the Wetenhall family. During this time, Janet, his cousin Rupert's widow, was still very much alive and living with Darcy. And it wasn't long before Darcy married someone who he thought was the love of his life, Jan MacDonald. But here's the twist, their marriage wasn't the fairy tale you'd imagine. In fact, if you were to call it anything, it was probably more of a nightmare. The truth is, Darcy's motivations in life were deeply rooted in his desire to climb the social ladder, to prove that he could move in circles far above where he had come from. He wanted to marry the right woman, someone who could elevate his status and help him cement his place in high society. And that's exactly what he thought he was doing when he married Jan. But despite everything he thought he wanted, Darcy was never truly cut out for marriage, and he certainly wasn't kind to women. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, Jan would later claim that Darcy was abusive, both physically and mentally. She described him as a cruel man, capable of telling outrageous lies without a second thought. But despite the harshness of their marriage, they did have a son together, Guy Wettenhall, born in 1968. But things didn't stay smooth for long. When Guy was only 2 years old, Jan had finally had enough and decided to leave Stanbury, taking her son with her. But in a surprising twist, Darcy actually managed to gain custody of their son. This wasn't a common occurrence back then. It wasn't typical for a father to gain full custody, especially when the mother was still alive and involved in the child's life. So how did he pull it off? It wasn't by accident. Darcy had a plan. While Jan was studying nursing, Darcy swooped in and took control. Guy, who had been staying with his grandparents, was taken from Jan's care. It was a sneaky, and some would say dastardly move. Jan was left powerless, unable to do much to stop it. But that wasn't the end of it. Once Darcy had custody of Guy, things took an even darker turn. Jan would later recall how, when she tried to visit her son at Stanbury, Darcy would always have an excuse. He'd say that Guy couldn't see her because he was out at football or pony club. It became clear to Jan that Darcy wasn't just keeping Guy away from her, he was actively trying to keep them apart. Over time, Jan began to believe that Darcy was deliberately turning their son against her, and her suspicions only grew stronger as Guy got older. By the time Guy was 13, the damage was done. He cut off all contact with Jan and never spoke to her again. No matter how much she tried, she never got the chance to rebuild her relationship with her son. And Darcy wasn't just cruel to his wife. He had a rocky relationship with pretty much all the women in his life. Many people have pointed out that even his cousin Rupert's wife Janet wasn't spared from his harsh treatment. Interestingly, from the moment he married, Darcy's only goal was to have a son, never a daughter. Some people have speculated that his issues with women had something to do with internalized misogyny. After all, Darcy grew up during a time when traditional gender roles were heavily enforced. Men were expected to be tough, unemotional, and dominant, while women were mostly seen as caretakers and housewives. So it makes sense that Darcy's attitudes might have been shaped by these old school ideas. But it's also possible that his problems went deeper. You know, when you look at his life, it becomes pretty clear that Darcy struggled with his own identity, especially when it came to his sexuality. Back in the 1950s and 60s, when homosexuality was illegal and frowned upon, men like Darcy were forced to hide their true selves. In fact, a lot of people who were attracted to the same sex during that time had to bury those feelings deep down, sometimes even denying them to themselves. Darcy may have been one of those men. His behavior, especially toward women, could have been a reflection of his inner turmoil. Now, if you're wondering what Darcy was like as a father, well, it's a bit complicated. On the outside, he seemed like he was giving his son Guy everything a boy could want. Private school education, horses, ponies, ski trips in the winter, you name it. It wasn't that Darcy didn't provide for his son. In fact, he did, but in his own way. The thing is, it wasn't about love or affection. It was all part of Darcy's vision for his son, a vision that Guy didn't have a choice but to follow. At this point in time, Bob Perry, a longtime neighbor of Darcy's, had also been secretly in a relationship with him. Just like Darcy, Bob was married with 2 kids. And back then, being gay wasn't exactly something people would openly talk about. They both had to hide their true identities, keeping their relationship a secret, even from their own families. A year after Bob and his wife parted ways, Darcy stepped in to support Bob, offering him a home and a job at Stanbury. In fact, there's a photo of Bob and his children living at Darcy's property, where Bob also served as Guy's co-executive. Then, in early 1991, things started to shift. Bob reached a point where he wanted to live his life openly as a proud gay man, but Darcy wasn't on board with that at all. So Bob made the tough decision to leave. He was a bank manager and got transferred to different branches, which meant he could easily commute between Melbourne and where they were living. But the more time Bob spent away from Darcy, the more he realized that he could actually be much happier in a new environment. Along the way, Bob found someone else he fell for. Even though that person didn't feel as strongly about him as he had hoped, it was still enough to make him take the leap and move to Melbourne to be closer to this new love. Once he was far enough from Darcy, he realized that he didn't want to stay stuck in such a toxic situation anymore. It's also important to note that Darcy and Bob had been in a relationship for 10 years, a whole decade of shared lives, struggles, and secret moments. So when Bob decided to walk away, it hit Darcy hard. It wasn't just the fact that Bob had moved on and was now living as a free man, but also that Darcy was still hiding who he truly was. And that left him feeling lost and empty. He couldn't ignore the fact that he was still stuck in a life of pretending, while Bob had finally chosen to live openly and freely. After Bob left, Darcy sought comfort in all the wrong places. He found himself flirting with young homeless men in Melbourne, often picking them up from Gill Memorial Home for Men. This shelter, though long gone, used to be a place for men who had just come out of prison. It was a temporary home for those trying to rebuild their lives. Darcy would offer them food, a place to sleep, and sometimes work on his farm, but his intentions weren't exactly pure. While he did help these men, there was another side to his actions. He was drawn to younger men, and it seemed like part of Darcy's self-loathing pushed him toward men who were troubled or in difficult situations. Some even say that he was drawn to men he could manipulate or control, whether that was through their vulnerabilities or his position of power. And that's when he met 23-year-old Wayne Gary Walton. Wayne wasn't just any young man. His background was heartbreaking and dark. At the age of 11, Wayne had witnessed his own father murder his 7-year-old sister right in front of their mother. His father, who had just gotten out of prison, had believed that his wife was having an affair with one of the men from the prison, and that belief drove him to commit this unspeakable act. Some people say that Wayne's relationship with his father wasn't just tragic because of what he witnessed, but also because he was a victim of abuse from his father at an early age. That kind of trauma doesn't just disappear, it shapes who you become. The violence and pain Wayne endured growing up became a part of him, influencing his choices and actions as he got older. Now, the reason Wayne ended up in prison before Darcy even picked him up is because of theft. It wasn't a minor thing. Wayne had a history of getting into trouble. According to Wayne, Darcy first offered him a job and a place to stay, which seemed like a decent deal at the time. But just a few days later, Wayne claimed that Darcy made a sexual advance toward him. From there, things got even more complicated. While not much is known about the 4 months they spent together, one thing is certain. They were in a relationship. But it wasn't your typical romantic setup. If you're thinking that Wayne and Darcy had a sweet, loving relationship, you might want to rethink that. Sure, they were together for a few months, but their connection wasn't based on love or care. It was all about power and manipulation. Wayne actually had the upper hand because he knew Darcy's deepest secret, his hidden sexuality. That gave Wayne a major advantage. He could use that information to control Darcy, and there was a darker side to this relationship too. Blackmail played a role. Wayne knew how to push Darcy's buttons, and he wasn't shy about using that power to get what he wanted. What made the situation even more complicated was Wayne's upbringing in an abusive and violent household. That kind of environment doesn't just teach you to survive, it teaches you to fight back when someone tries to dominate you. So when Darcy attempted to control or belittle Wayne, it triggered something deep inside him. This might have been what transpired on March 18, 1992. It was a day that started like any other but quickly spiraled into a nightmare. During a heated argument, Wayne Walton snapped. Fueled by amphetamines and months of building tension, he grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun and killed Darcy Wettenhall and his son Guy Wettenhall. But it didn't stop there. Remember, 81-year-old Janet Wettenhall, Darcy's cousin Rupert's wife. She was also living with them at the time. Tragically, she became another victim of Wayne's violent outburst. The next day, Wayne was apprehended by police. He was found driving a stolen car with stolen items from the Wettenhall family's farm in his possession. It wasn't long before he was charged with 3 counts of murder. But the horror didn't end there. As shocking as the murders were, what came next rocked the entire country. As mentioned earlier, Darcy was a well-known figure in Australia and had been the center of attention for years, so naturally his death made headlines everywhere. But just a few weeks after his death, the post-mortem results were released, and they uncovered something that no one saw coming. Darcy had been HIV positive. In a time when HIV was still shrouded in fear and uncertainty, this revelation was a bombshell. People were terrified of the virus, and the stigma surrounding it was at its peak. Many, including Bob, had suspected that Darcy knew something was wrong with his health, but had kept it hidden. After all, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, being diagnosed with HIV usually meant a life expectancy of no more than 3 years. Though Darcy was in his early 50s, he was no spring chicken, and his health had been steadily declining. Bob recalls how Darcy often had terrible night sweats, a common early symptom of HIV at the time. He also had rashes and was a heavy smoker, which didn't help his situation. But Darcy, true to form, kept everything to himself. But why did Wayne kill Guy and Janet along with Darcy? Some believe that deep down, Wayne was trying to eliminate the hypocrisy and privilege that he saw around him. He might have viewed the Wettenhall family as symbols of everything wrong in the world. The perfect, well-off family who lived in a world he could never access. In his twisted mindset, taking them out could have seemed like a way to make things right. But of course, Wayne was under the influence of amphetamines at the time, which clouds any sort of rational thinking, so his reasoning likely wasn't clear or even fully coherent. A year later, on February 22, 1993, Wayne took his own life in a tragic and chilling turn of events. While waiting for his trial for the murders, he committed self-harm by hanging himself with a television cable in the management and supervision section of Pentridge Prison's B Division. If there had been a trial, we might have learned much more about Wayne's troubled life, his motivations, and the dark undercurrents that led to the murders. But he never made it to court, taking his own life before facing any legal consequences. The potential for deeper investigation and more shocking revelations died with him. The aftermath of the murders wasn't just a personal tragedy. It marked the end of an era for the Wettenhall family. Their once thriving stud farm operations were brought to a halt. The Stanbury property, which had been so closely tied to the family's legacy, was auctioned off in December of 1992. It was purchased by former Royal Agricultural Society of Victoria president Stephen Spargo and his wife Jill, who took over what had once been Darcy's domain. After the shootings, Bob couldn't shake the guilt. That hit him hard. He'd never really talked about his relationship with Darcy. But one day, a chat with Neil Drennan, a journalist and bookseller from Casterton, sparked something in him. Bob, now living in the Otways, south of Casterton, was a big fan of reading and regularly stopped by Drennan's bookshop. One day, he casually told Drennan, "I've got a story you can write." That conversation eventually led to Drennan's true crime book, The Devil's Grip, a true story of shame, sheep, and shotguns, which tells the story of the Wettenhall family. According to Bob, he carried a huge weight of unnecessary guilt over the murders. He felt like he was responsible, like he had left the gate open and let the devil in, even though he had always tried to protect Darcy, Guy, and Janet. But after Bob stepped away, everything started to fall apart. The book dives into the shame, fear, and hidden lives in conservative rural areas, where being gay was so out of the norm that people would joke you'd been kicked in the head by a horse. Now I'd love to hear your thoughts. Since Wayne is no longer around, do you think something bigger was behind the murders? Do you believe there might have been some kind of abuse between Wayne and Darcy before things escalated? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the way we create these videos and want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.